As we enter into the month of July, Mercedes Benz South Africa announced a suspension of their operations at their East London plant. They officially framed it as planned shutdowns due to production volume adjustments, but the timing does raise eyebrows. It's just 2 months earlier, the United States imposed 25% tariffs on imported vehicles, directly affecting one of South Africa's most export-dependent manufacturing lines. Over 90% of the production at the East London plant is exported, with North America being one of the key destinations for it. So, although Mercedes Benz South Africa has not explicitly blamed the tariffs, they haven't denied it either. And joining me to unpack this is Chris Hattingh, Executive Director for the Centre for Risk Analysis. He's been tracking the developments in South Africa's manufacturing sector and the ripple effects of global trade disruptions. Thank you, Chris, for joining us on that side of the mic. So let me start here. Mercedes-Benz is playing it cautiously in public. They're sticking to phrases like volume adjustments and planned shutdowns. But we know the UF tariffs are in the background. How much of this suspension do you think is really a response to market forces? And how much do you think it is about geopolitics?
Thanks very much, Anlu. It is nice for a change to be on this side of the microphone. So, to me, the possibility of the higher US reciprocal tariffs, I don't want to discount that. I don't want to discount the increased disruption to global trade and just the increased uncertainty. So let's assume on the 9th of July, we're recording on the 1st of July. Let's assume on the 9th, the auto tariffs on South Africa are in place, as well as the 31% reciprocal tariffs on all South African imports into the US. I don't want to discount that factor in terms of planning, in terms of plant production, all that kind of stuff, exports, etc., etc. But higher US tariffs aren't the main reason that the patient has now been moved into the ICU. The main reason that we've got companies like Mercedes Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, and some others in the South African context in the hospital in the first place is because of the domestic challenges that they encounter in the South African context. So things like inconsistent and unreliable logistics, inconsistent electricity supply, labor disruptions, and of course, high rates of crime. You couple all of that with South Africa's domestic trade policy space, where you've got things like localization master plans and others that do make it relatively more difficult to compete and for international companies to operate in South Africa. So unfortunately for our auto sector, our traditional domestic auto sector, these US tariffs do come at a very inopportune time. But I think they're exposing just how brittle South African auto manufacturing and indeed manufacturing as a whole is. And just a last note before I hand back over to you. As we speak, we are busy finalizing our latest macro review report in which we delve into South African manufacturing and mining in depth.
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense that many of these disruptions would not have been, or the tariff impact would perhaps not have been so big if, in the first place, many of these industries were not in the hospital, as you said. But before we move past the point of geopolitical risks, how exposed do you think the South African auto manufacturing industry is to these kind of geopolitical risks like tariffs? Do you think we are too dependent on a few key export markets?
I think that's very much has been the case. If we go back to what you mentioned in your introduction, how reliant Mercedes-Benz is on the US in terms of an export market. If we think about South Africa and the relationship with those companies domestically and their international holding companies or parent companies, in the case of those European auto manufacturers, where South Africa forms part of that global supply chain or value chain. But a lot of those vehicles are manufactured in South Africa, but not sold in South Africa or indeed sub-Saharan Africa. So then if that's your case, where you've got these supply chains and value chains more geographically spread out, when there is geopolitical tension and upheaval, those transport costs possibly increase. You have to relocate other forms of manufacturing. What Mercedes-Benz is doing now, there are other examples of companies like Nissan and some others that they do this kind of thing regularly, where they would shut down a plant or a factory to retrofit or to rejig global supply. I don't want to discount that sort of thing happens, but in the current climate of where we are so exposed and have been so exposed in terms of our risk on exporting to only certain places, it does, I think, expose South Africa even more. I was also remiss in the first sort of response to you, I mentioned some of the domestic challenges. One thing that I think our auto companies that we've been highlighting from a CRA point of view for a while is, again, not to dismiss high US reciprocal tariffs, all that kind of thing. I think a bigger risk, existential risk, comes from Chinese auto manufacturers who have already started building much more of a footprint in South Africa, presenting serious competition to companies like Mercedes Benz. They're getting more of the consumer market or the consumer share than was the case before. And if now we get the higher US tariffs, it's another element of competition for our traditional auto manufacturers to deal with.
Yeah, and I think much of this shows up in our investor confidence as well, especially when it comes to the manufacturing base. So do you think, I know, for example, that East London was really positioned as one of the lead plants for Mercedes-Benz after they had a major injection last year. How do you think this suspension affects investor confidence in South Africa as a whole as a manufacturing hub, given that there are some of these external, perhaps stronger manufacturing bases around the world?
So much is going to hinge on how Mercedes-Benz communicates this, where, as you've highlighted, they've tried to use more neutral terminology. Also, quite a bit will hinge for investors and for business confidence on and manufacturing confidence on how the government responds to this kind of thing. So do we see statements from DTIC and others where they say, this isn't a big deal, don't worry about it, it'll all be taken care of? Or do we see, I'm not saying, throwing their hands up in the air and saying it's an emergency, but do we see a more proactive approach and saying, yes, here are the challenges, here's what we are trying to do from our side on the infrastructure space, on the policy space, to meet with these traditional manufacturers, see what their domestic challenges are, and how we can equip them and help them in some kind of way to deal with. I know that opens up a big risk in terms of just more subsidies that could just be presented as the sort of catch-all solution, which I don't think in any way goes towards fixing those infrastructure challenges and other issues that make manufacturing more expensive in South Africa. But we're going to have to see if there's a bit of a psychological change. I don't see any reason to believe that kind of thing yet, but perhaps the current sort of global geopolitical upheaval presents a great opportunity in that regard to deal with it accordingly. It doesn't help to pretend that things were different. This is the reality we have to deal with.
From a risk perspective, what do you think suppliers and component manufacturers should be preparing for in the second half of the year?
Yeah, I guess number one, it's maybe too easy an answer, but number one is possibly higher input costs. So if we've got higher tariffs, that does filter down to the manufacturers and ultimately to consumers in terms of possibly higher costs. You've possibly got the issue of job layoffs. So if your labor costs remain consistent, but your other input costs increase, this is again one of those neutral terms that very big corporates would use, but they talk about efficiency gains and that kind of thing, which unfortunately in many cases does in some part rely on job cuts. We look at not necessarily plant closures, but some kind of retooling of some of these plants where there are fewer job opportunities, but they lean more in towards automation and other ways of trying to make their footprint in South Africa as efficient as possible from a technology point of view. So I think there's quite a few things on the go at the moment into the second half of the year, assuming the domestic situation remains stable, where we've got the GNU still holding, and you've got electricity supply from Eskom better relative to where it was a year or 2 years ago. But you've still got your logistics concerns and high rates of crime. I think that does present a continued very difficult environment in which to operate. And then you add that in the US tariff ingredient into this particular pot. I don't think, for what it's worth, that by the 9th of July, the US is going to make trade deals with all of its trading partners. There's simply too little time to go. The only fixed deal that has been done up until this point was with the United Kingdom. And then there's a sort of a truce that has been in place between the US and China. But I think for the time being, the Trump administration will want to keep the tariff negotiation as one of its sort of trade tools to rejig global trade. That means it's going to continue using things like auto tariffs and reciprocal tariffs with countries like South Africa. And that unfortunately then filters into how companies make their investment decisions.
Yeah, I want us to zoom in even a little bit more. I think As we zoom out a little bit more, you speak of this quite often, but as we move into an era of more transactional trade agreements or a transactional trade environment, how do you think the South African manufacturing industry should rethink some of the incentives and perhaps subsidies that we actually offer to both local and international manufacturers?
I mean, if you compare South Africa and our domestic manufacturing to some other places such as Southeast Asia, maybe Latin America, we do have in our favor still relatively lower labor costs compared to some of those places. You've got the trade route, of course, around Cape Town, around the Cape, which we've already seen pick up since the disruption of trade in the Suez Canal by the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which took place over the last year or so, attacking container shipping. So that trade route has really picked up. So we've got the geostrategic positioning in that regard. And then we've got the links with the rest of the countries around us. Now, the consumer markets in those particular countries and in South Africa are under relatively more pressure. They don't have the spending capacity that European consumers have, for example, or even American or Chinese. But there is a lot more volume, and there's the potential, if you lower some of these costs, that you can take advantage of that should the growth situation improve in South Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. So maybe the last point here on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we've got ostensibly a push towards making trade easier, lowering trade costs. From a manufacturer's point of view, the more they can lean into that, the more they can put pressure on government to get those things really moving. So like ports, railways, border operations, that processes are as easy and as affordable as possible. That kind of thing. I know it sounds very boring and very basic, but it does now hinge on getting these basics right in this current environment. Now is not the time for trying to find silver bullets and things like that. I think it really is about getting those costs in hand as much as possible. And then again, what kind of value can you offer to consumers? So I know that the charge often against China and Chinese companies is they undercut their consumers, they dump goods in given markets. Accepting that as the reality, how do you deal with that then? How do you convince your consumers who have been very loyal to you for decades, never mind years, that you still deserve that kind of relationship as Mercedes Benz, as Volkswagen, as BMW, as others? We've got the loyalty, but you need to look like you're offering the kind of value that people think they can now get elsewhere.
Yeah, you briefly touched on the point of becoming a dumping ground, and I think it's important to perhaps touch on the topic of there has been a global shift towards more electric vehicles, and South Africa has very limited infrastructure and demand for that kind of thing. Do you think there is a risk of us becoming a dumping ground for many of these, what is soon to perhaps be outdated production lines?
I think that is a possibility. Again, it depends on what sort of tariff regime that the government implements. So do they raise tariffs on some of those goods? Of course, the risk then is that you increase costs for consumers. So the best example in this regard is solar panels, where more of most, if not the majority of your manufacturers of some of the components of your solar panels are, of course, in China. If you raise the tariffs on those, you increase the cost of the imports. And in the South African case, where so many companies and individuals have tried to state-proof themselves against Eskom by installing solar panels, you would then make them more exposed in that regard. So it's a tricky game or tightrope to walk with subsidies and with tariffs. So we'll need to see what exactly the route is that the government pursues in this way. I think on the EV point, you're seeing just more options from Chinese manufacturers for South African consumers. So even though there is a very high tax or tariff on EVs imported into South Africa, those companies are still managing to make them less expensive relative to some of the options from your more traditional auto manufacturers. So I think to those Chinese companies that can present as affordable options in the plug-in hybrid space, so that you can have your rechargeability with your socket at home, versus also then having the ability to just put petrol in your car as per normal, that could also eat into some of the market share. But I don't think overnight we're just going to go pure EV. As you rightly say, we don't have the infrastructure to support that.
Excellent. That's where we'll leave it. The suspension of operations might seem like it is temporary, but it might seem like it's on the surface. but it certainly does expose some of the deeper questions about South Africa's competitiveness and the factors that South African manufacturers have to deal with on a domestic level. Yeah, thanks again, Chris Hattingh, for joining us, and thank you for watching.